Welcome to STEAM Powered, where I have conversations with women in STEAM to learn a little bit about what they do and who they are. I'm your host, Michelle Ong. My guest today is Dineen, a genetic counsellor and podcaster who is passionate about science communication. Through her main show, DNA Today, Kira makes information about genetic technology, disorders, and news accessible to the world. Join us as we speak about Kira's journey to genetics, genetic counselling, and what we can and can't learn from DNA testing kits. So good morning, Kira. Thank you for joining me today on STEAM Pod. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today about your journey to genetics and all the awesome work that you do.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on, Michelle. And I have to just start by complimenting your accent. I'm just, a sucker for lots of types of accents, but I just love yours.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, mine's a bit of a mix, actually. I keep getting told that I've got this very American R. I do have this strong rhotic R thing happening that
Huh.
happens periodically. So a little bit of
I'll
Aussie, a
I'll
little
pay
bit of
attention
Brit,
to it during
bit
the
of
episode.
American. Very cool. Yeah, you'll probably hear it. It just comes up. Great. So, genetics. Like, that's what you started out in when you studied, but what drew you to the field?
Yeah, so I always found genetics to just be intriguing. I think when I started learning about it in middle school, high school, I was like, this just seems to be such an interesting area. And my teachers, I'd ask all these questions, whatever, and they're like, a lot of the answers were, we don't know yet. And I
Yeah.
found that to be so exciting because I'm like, wow, there's so much we still need to learn in genetics. If I go into this, there's just constantly going to be new information. I'm never going to be bored by genetics. So I think that was one aspect to it, that I just knew that there was just so much. Like, even something I remember being told in high school, that there's something called junk DNA. That's not a
Mm-hmm.
thing anymore. We don't call that junk DNA. So, and I graduated high school in 2013. So, we're about 10 years later now. So it's just so interesting, just in that 10 years, things I was taught was like, oh, that's inaccurate now, right? Like, Pluto's not a planet kind of thing. So I think
Mind
that, to
blowing.
me, yeah, is just really exciting. And I knew I wanted to be in a field that constantly had new information, new updates, and just it's thrilling to be a part of that.
That is very cool. Is it just about genetics, or is it all science altogether? Is science something that you were particularly, had an affinity for, or was it just when genetics came up that it just went, oh my God, this blows my mind. This is a thing.
Yeah, definitely genetics was like my sweet spot, but I think biology in general I loved.
Yeah.
So I didn't as much love chemistry, like that side of science, because I wasn't good at it. I thought it was cool, but I'm like, this is really hard. I'm not so great at math. So that was not my strong suit.
Yeah.
So I always just found like biology be interesting. Like my freshman year in college, I had taken AP bio in high school, so sort of skipped that once I got to college. And so I started with cell biology and like molecular biology, because that's actually what I started majoring in, and then switched to
Hmm.
genetics once I found out my college actually offered that. So
Ooh, shiny.
um, yeah, so and I told my college, I was like, my specific genetics program, I'm like, y'all got to do better at advertising, because I had no idea it existed until I was already at the school. Like, I was looking for colleges that had genetic programs, and I went to the University of Connecticut, which I absolutely loved. And so when I was going there, I was like, well, I can major in molecular cell bio and take a lot of genetics classes. I'm like, all right, that's good enough. But then I discovered, oh, there actually is a genetics program.
Yeah.
So I joke about that with my mentors there. But yeah, it was just, I think it's just so interesting, like all angles of biology in that way.
So when you did that course, where did you think you were going to go with that as a career?
So in high school, I definitely considered a couple different courses, in terms of like, where I was going to go in my career in life. There was a short time period I considered being a PA. I was like, I'm pretty good with just bodily fluids, different things like that. I'm like, maybe I'll do okay in that role. Um, I also considered going into like neuroscience, because I think the brain is just so interesting. Another area where we have so much to learn in that
Hmm.
space. But I just kept coming back to genetics. And for me, I was like, I don't know if I picture myself in a lab. And that's a lot of what I saw when I thought about as a high schooler, like I was like, well, if I want to go into genetics, does that mean I'm doing genetic research? Like, is that the only career option? That's a really fascinating area, but I was like, I don't know. I'm such a communications person, clearly, as I like podcasting. And so I was like, I don't think that's enough talking for me. That's too much alone time for me, you
Yeah.
know? And so then I discovered genetic counseling and I was like, here we go. I can educate people about genetics and be on
Hmm.
top of the field and learning about all these advancements. And so that I was like, okay, now this is clicking. This makes sense as a career for me. And so I think it's tough to learn about all the different careers in sciences, right? In
Yeah.
STEAM, as you cover on this show, because it's like you hear about the ones, you see in the media, but it's like I really
There's so
want to be
much
able to
more to it.
see even more. Yeah. It's like a lot of people that are applying into the genetic counseling field learned about it in college when it was like it would have really behooved them to learn about it sooner so they could have
Mm.
tailored their college experience to preparing to apply to genetic counseling grad schools. So
Yeah.
I think that's, something that's my soapbox of like, check out genetic counseling and see if that's a fit for you. Maybe it's not. Maybe you like the lab better. And everyone has their place that they excel in and feel more comfortable in. But that was kind of my track of figuring out. So I was like pretty sure I wanted to be a genetic counselor once I was then enrolling at college.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, as you said, it's just one of those things where because there's so many subfields and specializations in all of STEAM, like when you're at school, they just go bio, chem. It's so broad. How do you narrow it down? But then if you narrow it down too much, that's too focused, and everyone isn't going to understand what the full scope of all of it is. But how do you get the full scope of all of it? It's yeah, it's a chicken and egg problem, and it's so
It is.
problematic because so many people will go, "Oh, but I don't like bio," and then, but do you like this sort of things? Like that's still bio. It's just a different part of bio.
Right, like plant biology. Interesting, but I don't know too much about it. I don't know how good I would be at that side of biology,
Yeah,
but I'm really good at genetics. That's a part of biology. So as you said, it's like there's all these little niches within these spaces, and I think that's why shadowing is so
mm,
important, and I think it's challenging in today's day and age, I think especially with COVID restrictions, but it's great if you're able to go because even if you shadow and you're done with that day and seeing that person in that role and you say to yourself, I do not want to do that job. That's valuable information.
it
It's
is.
not just like, oh, I found a job that I really want to do. It's also good to like count out, I don't think that's going to be good for me because it's much
Yeah.
better to spend a day shadowing someone or a week or month, whatever it is, and say, I don't want to do that, than go through a whole program. And now you have a degree where you're maybe boxed in, depending on what kind of
Mm.
degree that is. I find it just so valuable, or even if you don't have the opportunity to shadow of people being able to talk and interview people in these roles, even just listening to podcasts like yours and learning from people that way. Or just doing a quick like Zoom call, or if someone's local to you, like, hey, can I buy you a coffee and just like ask you about your job for a half hour?
Exactly.
Um, I found that was very helpful to me, high school and college, to really figure out, even for myself, like, okay, as a genetic counselor, what do I want to do within that field, right? So every step you take, you're like, okay, that's one step closer, but like, there's lots of different areas that genetic counselors work in within healthcare. So it's like, even that, okay, that's a choice, but then you're like, okay, what's the next step? Like, what do I specialize in?
Exactly. It's almost as though you need like a specialist speed dating service where you just go, right, 15
Yes.
minutes, break it down for me, let's go.
Yeah, Michelle, maybe we need to create that. Some kind of like speed career dating, speed career matching, something like that.
I know, it really is. Like, here's a 15-minute primer of, this kind of thing that I do. Is this something of interest to you? It's like, no, but the thing that you mentioned right here, could I talk to someone who does that thing?
Right. Like, oh, when you said you send patients to this, or you read research papers of people doing that, give me a person that does that so I can like explore it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like work the networking. Yeah.
I know, absolutely. That's a thing that I think we should do these days. There's just so much now, and it's so hard to be able to pin down, what you'd like. And colleges and universities, they pin you down to a specialization. It's like, yeah, but the thing that I do now is that going to be what I do when I get out? And it's not always the case. Like what I do wasn't taught at uni. And a lot of people I know who are specialists in their field didn't study that specifically or didn't know it existed when they first started. So
Or
yeah,
it didn't
definitely need an
exist
option.
when they first
Yeah, or
started,
it
right?
didn't
Like they're the
exist.
ones that
Absolutely.
found it or something or invented it. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Backtracking a bit, what is genetic counseling?
Yes, I was going to say I've been throwing out this term and I am not defining my terms here.
Yeah.
So, a genetic counselor is a healthcare provider that helps people understand how genetics affects their health. So, it's a very broad definition that I use, but this can be applied to lots of areas, as I mentioned. So, I work in prenatal. So, I work with pregnant people and people looking to become pregnant, talk about the genetics of their future or current pregnancy, go through family history, talk about any conditions that I'd be, suspicious for. It's on my radar that their baby could have. There's other genetic counselors that work in cardiac, neuro, pediatric, cancer. I mean, so many different areas. Um, and within that, working so many different types of roles. So I'm someone that directly meets with patients. And so that's a patient facing role, direct patient care. Now, some of my friends and colleagues will work directly with genetic counselors. So as a genetic counselor, they're helping to educate other genetic counselors for, like, say, testing that's new and available and understanding all the nuances of that and
Yeah.
saying, okay, this is the pros and cons. This is the benefits, limitations of certain testing. As genetic counselors have questions, they're like, hey, I got this report. I don't really understand this, like, section or something. Can you walk me through this? And then there's genetic counselors in research, that we mentioned. So researching in any of these areas I mentioned or others. There's genetic counselors that are, more focused on educating not just other genetic counselors, but other healthcare providers. So
Mm.
doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners, all different types of people in healthcare that may be ordering genetic testing, because it's not just genetic counselors ordering genetic testing. That would
Yep.
be a nightmare because there's only about 5,000 of us in United States and Canada. I don't off the top of my head know about Australia. I got to add that to my list of stats to have in my head. But we're a relatively new field, so
Hmm.
we've been around for about 50 years, which is
Yeah, it's
considered new
baby.
in
Yeah.
science. Yeah, like we're a baby. I'd say maybe we're like toddler child at this point.
Yep.
But yeah, it's such an interesting area, and what's great, and obviously I'm biased, but what's great about the field and as a career, like, let's say, I love my job. I've been doing this for 2 years. I graduated 2 years ago from grad school. But let's say in 10 years or something, I'm like, you know what? I really want to go into cancer.
Mm.
I've done my time in prenatal. I really want to freshen things up and start meeting with cancer patients or people that have a family member that have passed away from cancer or were recently diagnosed, something like that. I can do that because my
Mm.
degree is in human genetics. So I can take that in a lot of different directions, which is
Yeah.
also what I like, the flexibility in terms of, I think I'm going to be very old when I retire because I just love working and I love what I do,
That's a good
which I'm
thing.
very fortunate. Yeah, to be in that role. But there's just so many different opportunities, even being in these grad programs and teaching genetic counselors. I'm also a supervisor. So I have genetic counseling students that rotate with me. So there's just so many different angles of my job and role. And, then you throw podcasting on top of that and everything. So
Yeah, exactly. It's heaps to do. Absolutely lots keeping you busy. So, with all the genetic counseling work, is it only people who have, prior concerns? Because, as you said, example, history or an actual condition who will come speak to you? Or is it something that more people who are just wanting to explore, just want to check things out, who will come to you? Because you hear about some of these conditions where they don't know about it until they have a kid and they go, oh, the kid's got it. One of us was a carrier. It's one of these things where if you don't know what you don't know, how do you start this process?
yeah, that's a great question. And it definitely depends on a genetic counselor's role. So some genetic counselors will see patients if there's an indication. There's something that's bringing the patient in. Either their doctor referred them or they're a self-referral. Like they were like, hey, something's going on. I want to see a genetics professional.
Hmm.
In my role, so I work at a private practice, OBGYN. So we have our obstetric side and we have our GYN side. And so I meet with all of the pregnant patients at our practice. And then if that's just part of our routine care. So I'm seeing a lot of people that have low risk pregnancies and also some that have high risk pregnancies because of, we're a high risk pregnancy center.
Yep.
So the other side of that is during people's annual GYN visits, if
Mm-hmm.
they mention, oh, I'm thinking about maybe trying to conceive soon, then the GYN will say, all right, on your way out, book an appointment with Kira so you can go over something called carrier
History.
screening that you were alluding to. Yeah, where we can do this genetic screening prior to someone actually conceiving,
Mm.
because we're looking at both biological parents' genetic information to see, are they matching for a condition where their future pregnancies could inherit that. So that could be something like sickle cell, cystic fibrosis. There's a long list, hundreds of conditions that work in this way
Mm-hmm.
where both parents need to be carriers of that. And usually you don't have any symptoms from being a carrier. So like you said,
Yeah.
oftentimes people find out that they're a carrier of a condition because someone in the family has been diagnosed. And then that kind of leads everybody to start looking at that. So I'm a little bit of a mixture, but a lot of genetic counselors, like let's say in the neuro space, they may just see patients that have a diagnosis of a neuro condition.
Mm.
So something like Parkinson's, different conditions there, Alzheimer's, and they might explore genetic testing options to see like, oh, can we find a genetic cause specifically for this that maybe your family members want to be tested for? So it's really all over the map, and I think it's
Yeah.
more specialty dependent than anything.
That's very interesting because, as you're in prenatal, I've had a child, and,
Yes,
in the
you have a
process, yeah.
daughter, right?
Yes, I do. So in the process for this, it's once you're, I think, 15 weeks, they get you to, give you the option to have the NIPD or the harmony test, so you can test for certain things. But that's kind of after the fact. So then you can, talk about what's going to come. Whereas, what you're doing is earlier intervention than that. You're trying to make sure that you're screening beforehand, which is interesting. It's an interesting way of approaching the way that you handle these things, especially because a lot of people have no idea what their genetics actually is going to involve, other than something that presents with actual physical symptoms. So yeah,
Right.
it's cool.
Yeah, and I explain to patients like I think of genetic conditions in two buckets.
Mm,
One being the random conditions where it randomly happens. There's knowing family history is not going to really be helping in those cases because
hmm.
it's just totally, we call that de novo, completely random. So you've got that bucket. Then the second bucket is inherited conditions. So like these, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell that I mentioned, and that's called autosomal recessive inheritance, where both biologic parents are carriers.
Yep.
So the NIPS test that you mentioned, non-invasive prenatal screening testing, that's the generic name, and then you got all the different brand names like Harmony that you mentioned.
Yep.
So, and I have a bunch of tests behind me because I'm in my office here.
Yep.
So for those are the random conditions. So in
Hmm.
order to look for that, you do have to be pregnant.
Yeah.
And it's so cool. I want to nerd out for a moment on how this test
Go
works.
for
So
it.
in a pregnant person, from their placenta, it naturally releases cells
Hmm.
and then it floats in your bloodstream. Those cells tend to pop open and then release their DNA. So you've got what's called cell-free DNA in your bloodstream. So by taking a normal, typical blood draw, we send that tube or two tubes off to the lab, and then they're able to, there's a couple different ways of doing it. One way is basically isolating that fetal DNA, which is really placental DNA, I forget in
Hmm.
particular, and look for, do we see any extra chromosome conditions? So something like, say, Down syndrome, where people that have Down syndrome have an extra chromosome number 21. So you and I have 2 copies of that chromosome. People with Down syndrome have 3 copies. So that's something that randomly happens. I'll say it's very rare. There is an inherited form, but that's only like 4% of people with Down syndrome. So vast majority of cases, it's random. So that's not something we can test for really ahead
Yeah.
of time, but the carrier screening is. So it's great. Like my ideal setup is when patients are at their GYN appointment, they're like, oh, I'm thinking about having kids soon or like trying. And then they meet with me, say the next day, the next week. We do the carrier screening, learn that information so that then they can decide, okay, are we going to try to conceive naturally? Do we want to do IVF so we can screen these embryos and then maybe implant an embryo that will not have a certain condition? And then once they're pregnant, then meet with me again. And then we get to do the test you were talking about, the
Yeah,
NIPS, the cell-free DNA. So those are kind of the two main tests that I talk about with every single patient.
that is very cool. And yeah, it's interesting that you've broken it down to these two categories because people don't really think about it in that way. It's like genetics is, and it's on and off. And that's the way that people approach it. It's like, well, yeah, but it's conditional. There's different types, there's different things and outcomes. And, there's so many different permutations because it's DNA. And that's very, very cool. I love that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think part of it is like people hear genetic and they just think inherited.
Mm,
And that makes sense. Like when we talk about our genetics and like, yes, you are a combination of a sperm and an egg and the genetics that came from that. But sometimes we have these random things that happen and that's how evolution happens and everything. But it is important to think like, okay, there's like inherited parts of genetics and then there's random parts.
yeah,
And that's what's, creates the beautiful diversity of humans. It's just having a combination of those two.
that is very cool. Okay, side topic because I only just thought about this now. I have done zero research on it. Um, the 23andMe ancestry blood tests, and they've got these pretty little graphs that say you are genetically predisposed to waking up at 7 a.m. How does that work? Is that legit?
Yes, that is a great question. So for these, we call them direct consumer kits, so DTCs.
Yep.
And this is where you basically you spit into a tube and you send it off to 23andMe, Ancestry. There's loads of different tests nowadays. And then they're looking at kind of two categories of information: the medical health education interesting side
Yes.
that you're mentioning, and then the other side I would say is ancestry.
Yep.
So the ancestry side is pretty good for people of European descent.
Yep.
It is not great for people of non-European descent.
Hmm.
So I have using myself as an example, I have mostly Polish, Irish, English, that kind of background. And that's been the family stories growing up. Oh, okay, we're from, Cork, Ireland is my paternal grandfather. And so I was kind of like, let me do the test and actually see if that's true, right? So do the test, and yes, East Cork, Ireland specifically, a little bit of Central
Wow.
Cork
Very
as well.
narrow.
But that's how specific it gets. Like talking about different counties. And I was
Hmm.
like, wow, this really lines up because I didn't tell 23andMe, oh, my grandpa says I'm from Cork. And so
Yeah.
they, did that. So for me, because I'm European ancestry, it can get as specific as that. Now, if I had ancestry from different areas of the world, it's not going to be as specific. So it's going to give you more regions and not, you're from this town, you're from this county. So there's a big discrepancy there that is slowly being addressed in genetics. I wish it was being addressed faster.
Mm.
Um, and this bleeds into even the other side that you're talking about too, of that interesting side, because it's like, I don't know, I want to call it medical, but then I'm like, no. So on this side of like, are you sensitive to caffeine, right? I've done a lot of these tests and it's like, you're very sensitive to caffeine. I'm like, yes, I am. You got that correct. I have a cup and I'm good for the day. Now, other things, I'm trying to think of other things on there. There's been other ones that I'm like, this is not true.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Like there
so
was one
it's
that
it's a
you're likely to wake
mix.
up at this time, or
Right. Yeah, I
like
can't I
you
can't
have
remember what my
one
results were
eyebrow
for
that
that.
can go up then more than the other one, and it's just weird little
Right.
things.
Yeah, like lots of weird things. And basically how they're figuring this out or making a guess, an educated guess, I think is the best way to phrase it. So what they're doing is they're looking at your genetics, but they're looking at specific points on your genetics. They're not reading through all of your genetics. That would be called a whole genome sequencing.
Yeah.
You're like spelling out all your genetics, all the letters. What they're doing is they're looking at hotspots and
Hmm.
saying, we've noticed that people that have a certain letter at that hotspot tend to be caffeine dependent, or tend to want to be, waking up early. Lots of different aspects there. Their metabolism tends to be faster. So all of these things that I've seen, and sometimes that's based off of one letter. And you're
Hmm.
like, okay, but there's lots of factors that play a role in this, right? Like how for the caffeine dependence, or just like if you're affected by it, well, how much caffeine have you had in your life? What's your tolerance level, right? Because
Yeah.
even that can change within your life. Like I've been a little
Hmm.
bit more caffeine dependent this summer because I've just been more busy, and I'm like, all right, early morning, got to do the caffeine. And other times in life, I'm like not drinking caffeine. So even like
Yeah.
that's gonna differ. Um, so if they're basing it off of just one letter in your genome,
Yep.
it's like, okay, that's one factor of a lot, right? That's one piece of a 1,000-piece puzzle. So is it somewhat backed? A little. I think it's better when we take everything into account. Now, if it's something that they say we look at 50 hotspots and not just one or two, that's going to have a little bit more evidence behind it.
Yeah.
So when we're doing that, that's called polygenic risk scores, and like looking at that, because many genic genes.
Hmm.
So we're looking at many genes to say, okay, now what are we saying your risk is for, now in the medical space, more like, say, developing heart disease. There's lots that go into that, right? It's not
Yeah.
just one, like, oh, do you have the gene for it or not, right? Or you have the mutation for it, I should say. It's you have to look at a lot. Like, okay, what's your lifestyle like? What's your diet, exercise? What's your family history like? So it's like oftentimes genetics is a part of the answer.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's completely the answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And, because of what you were saying with the way that they were very accurate with European, part of that's going to be because more medicine's done by European people in history. So they're going
Exactly.
to have all the data and the research in these specific areas. And part of it is, which, we started to establish when they were opening collection centers around the world, it's because they don't have enough data. So,
Exactly.
they lower the prices for the demographics they need more numbers for. So they don't have a lot of Asians, they need a lot of more Asians. But then you end up having this very vague kind of pool of information. And my sister's done the test. We have certain uh, suspicions, educated guesses that we've made about our family history. And my sister's test with Ancestry didn't really show any of what we suspected. And we're kind of doubtful of that. So I'm tempted to do the other test and kind of like cross reference and see what happens. Because, we're aware that the data is quite lean for our genetic history. So,
Yeah, and I think
yeah.
that's a great idea to do multiple, because I've done multiple and it differs a little bit. Some say I'm a little bit more like British than Irish, whatever. And I think another aspect that people are like, you know, curious about, or like something that comes up, and I know when one of my family members did it, came up like 1% Asian, and very, very general, right? And so my family was like so surprised by this. And I was like, honestly, like look back in 6 months, it will probably disappear.
Yeah.
Our ancestry is not changing. That has happened, right? That we can't change that. Now, our understanding of the data changes. So over
Yes.
time, basically we say, okay, these little hot spots, putting them all together, and they look at lots and lots of these. I don't
Mm-hmm.
even know. I would guess hundreds to thousands, probably in that area. I don't know. But so the more they understand of saying, okay, the combination of mine, they're like, okay, people from Cork, Ireland tend to have this. So that's how they're tracing it.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, what with my family coming back, and this was like my grandmother's sister, so pretty far out for me. That's, I think, like a third degree relative or something. So for that, it's like, okay, well, they could be basing it off one data point, and they may reanalyze that and say, oh, actually, that data point doesn't line up with ancestry from Asia in general. Now we're understanding, oh, maybe that was more Russia, right? So then
Yeah.
we'll look back. We haven't changed, but our understanding of genetics changes over time. So your genetics don't change over your life, but
Mm-hmm.
the way we can figure it out changes as we have more data, as you said, Michelle.
And that's one of the things I find really fascinating because one of my friends has 23andMe, and the data changes, the little bits of criteria and bits of information that they get more refined, or they go away, and things just come and go just as more data comes in to be able to feed into the machine that they determine what this all means. It's very cool and still vague, but very cool. Yeah. So podcasting, we're just running through the topics here. Podcasting, you've
Yeah, I
been
love
doing
it.
this for like 10 years, but how did you get into
Yeah.
it?
So, it was similar time for me in high school. So the first time I listened to a podcast was like 2008. And so I was going on a family trip. For reference, I'm in like 8th grade ish. And first time going on a plane, I'm like, how am I going to entertain myself? There's no internet up there. So I was like, okay, I want to type Harry Potter into like, back then it was iTunes, and see what comes up. Maybe there's some kind of video or whatever, right? And so I see this thing called MuggleCast, and I was like, okay, what is this? Like, that sounds interesting. And then I see it's like an audio file that's like an hour and a half long. I'm like, who would ever listen to an audio file that's an hour and a half long? Like, you listen to something for like a minute, 2 minutes, like a song or something, right? And so I was like, whatever, I'll download it. I won't listen to it, whatever. I'm bored on the plane. I hit play, and I don't know how familiar you are with Harry Potter and everything.
Yep.
So I hit play, and it's Hedwig's theme on an electric guitar. And I was like, this is cool. The nerd in me is like, this is awesome. So, playing this, and it's basically these kids that are like 5 years older than me, just talking about Harry Potter and, diving through the series and analyzing the books and the chapters and going through the news and what movies are coming out and everything. And I was like, this is so cool. I want to do something like this. Once
Yeah.
I found out they're only a few years older than me, I was
Achievable.
like, okay, maybe I could try this. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I started it, Harry Potter was covered. So I started with a Hunger Games series because I was really into the series. I still, love it. And so started with that, kind of figured out podcasting. And then after about a year, I started DNA Today, which is my genetics show.
That's
So
cool.
now we're celebrating 10 years of that on September 1st.
Amazing.
So very exciting.
Yeah.
It's just wild that it's been 10 years.
Yeah.
But for me, it was, starting the genetics show was a way of exploring genetics and having people take me, not hopefully seriously, but people even just taking interviews, because I was
Yeah.
17 at the time. Back then, especially, people were like, why does this 17-year-old want to talk to me about my career, my job? Like, that's just, a little weird. But if I said, hey, I want to interview you for my podcast, that got my foot in the door. So
Yeah.
it started out as a way of like, I want to learn about genetic careers. I want to figure out what's available to me, and maybe people will listen and follow along with my journey, and maybe it will just be something that allows me to talk to all these people. So I was like, no matter what, it's going to be a great experience.
Yeah.
I never dreamed it would turn into a business. I've got 5 other team members. So it's just really grown. We've won a couple podcast awards. We have over 35 sponsors. So it's just honestly been a dream come true. And it's really cool that I started it when I was like, I think I want to be a genetic counselor. And now here I am 10 years later, like doing it.
Yes.
So it's just been awesome to do so many fantastic interviews, and the episodes are short. They're about half hour. So I try to keep it short and sweet for people, because sometimes we do dive into, certain specific genetic topics. I try to keep it understandable for anybody that wants to tune in and listen. But it's just been quite a journey. And I mentioned earlier, like Down syndrome as an example. This year we had, I don't know if you've seen the Fox TV show, the American show Glee.
Yeah.
So one of the actresses on there, Lauren Potter, who plays Becky Jackson, that has Down syndrome, she came on the show and just shared about, her experience in life, having Down syndrome, being an advocate, her time on Glee, working with Jane Lynch, who's just a phenomenal actress.
Yeah.
So it's just been really cool to just hear from people that are, coming from all of these different walks of life, whether they have a genetic condition, or they're working in the field, or they're doing research, their child has a condition that they're advocating and raising money for. There's just so much to learn about in the field, and I'm just constantly learning, which is my happy place.
Yes. It's pretty much how I feel about doing STEAM part as well, because
Yeah.
I just love learning about what people do. I think it's fascinating. I think everyone's doing very cool jobs that are different from mine. And it's like, how do I approach people? Hang on. I want to do a podcast. If I have a podcast, then I have a reason to talk to people
Right.
I've never met before.
Exactly. That was my reason to start.
Yeah. And it's like, yeah, I'd love to talk to you about this because it's fascinating. And, at first I thought, it's like, no one will talk to me. I've got no clout. Nobody knows who I am. I'm just some rando. And one of the first, like in the first year, I was so surprised that quite a few of the people I approached were like, why do you want to talk to me? I'm really boring. The stuff that I do is
Right?
really
Everybody
boring.
has this like imposter syndrome of like, wait, you want to interview me? And it's just like, yeah, you're a cool person. You do cool stuff that I want to learn about.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, no, but I want to know what you do. What you do sounds great. I would love to know more. Please talk my ear off. I'm quite happy to do that. And what was the kicker after about 3/4 of the year? You've interviewed people who are so much more accomplished than I am, who have achieved so much more than I have. It's like, you do realize about a third of them just said the same thing you did. So it's like,
Need to get them all in a room and be like, just so you know, y'all said this about each other. So just, take the compliments.
Exactly. It's just one of those. It's like, okay, I kind of feel better now. I have more perspective about my own imposter syndrome. This is wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's such a great journey, podcasting. Like it's not something I considered doing before, and it's just such a great way to connect with people and learn about what they do, especially if you're interested in what they do. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, it's such a great way of networking. And, as I grow into myself and my career, like I realize how important networking is. And it's just fantastic when you can hop on a call with someone and, small talk is great, whatever, but you get into things and you just dive in deep and you may only spend half hour, an hour with that person, but it's such a quality conversation
It
that
is.
you can go back to that person 6 months, year later, and say, hey, I remember you mentioned that, like, that person, could you introduce me because of XYZ? And let me know if
Hmm.
there's anyone in my network I can introduce you to. And it's like, you
Absolutely.
just never know where things go. I mean, in my own career, because I started podcasting before I had like any kind of paid job other than like babysitting kind of thing. Um, Podcasting, I think, has led to every single job I've had. And somehow I've had like lots of jobs. Like at one point in college, I like had 4 jobs and I was just like, well, what am I doing? Like, this is crazy. Cause I'm just so passionate about so many things that I was just like really wanted to do a lot. Um, but like everything that I've had has come from the podcast.
Yeah.
Even my salary job here, I work directly basically for one doctor that owns this private practice, and he had listened to the show and knew that I was graduating soon. And he was like, any chance you want to come to interview here? And I was like, yes, I would love that. And when I was here, he's basically just like, I just wanted to see that you were the person on the podcast. Like, the job is yours. There's a little bit more to it, but, and I was just like, wow, podcasting is so powerful because especially when people listen to you, it's like they feel like they really know you. Like podcasters
Mm.
that I listen to, like in my mind, we're friends. They may not know I exist, but I'm like, I know so much about them. I've been listening to them for like, I mentioned MuggleCast, some of the podcasters on there, Andrew Sims, Laura T, like I've been listening to them since I was, how old are you in 8th grade? Like 13.
Yeah.
So, and I'm 27 now. So like, that's pretty much half my life I've been listening to them, and they do know who I am, which is pretty cool. I got to be on one of their shows a couple months ago,
Nice.
but, it's like you develop that relationship with
Mm.
hosts and you really learn to trust them. And I think having that trust with an audience is something that's very hard to achieve in other mediums like
Mm.
blog posts, even just short form videos. Like when it's a podcast and you could be doing very just like mundane but intimate things in your life. You're like, driving to work, you're washing dishes, you're like doing whatever you do, and they're just a part of your life. And I
Yeah.
think that there's just something so powerful about the way that podcasting works. And sometimes even just we do produce our show as a video show as well, but like, I don't know, I'm always just like the audio. I'm like kind of a purist when it comes to podcasting. Like to me, that's the podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's such a great way to connect with people. I definitely agree with you, Michelle.
It is. And it's amazing because they're running a podcast, they're talking about something they're passionate about. So you're actually learning about them through their passions. You may not know anything about them, but you know what they're passionate about. And that's where the connection comes. Yeah,
Yes, definitely.
absolutely. So speaking of passions, why is psychom so important to you?
Oh, man. I think it's so important for people to be able to be their own patient advocate. And the only way that they're going to be able to advocate for themselves or their child or, another loved one is having information. And so I find it so important to be able to provide people with free, understandable, and accurate information. So that's something that, I've certainly been able to do on DNA Today. And I think it's just so important for people to have these resources.
Mm-hmm.
And, as long as you speak English and you have somewhat of a maybe like high school education, then you should be able to learn from my show.
Yeah.
And I want to empower people so that they're able to do this, because no matter where you're living in the world, telehealth has changed the game.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had this for a while, but COVID really pushed telehealth so that no matter where you are, if you have an internet connection or if you can do a phone call, then you can get access to care.
Mm-hmm.
There's the whole, obviously the financial side and insurance, but I think it's just great for people to understand this so that they can make informed decisions about their health. And, as we kind of alluded to at the beginning of the show, prevention is not only cheaper, but there's just so many other levels to it of, the emotional side,
You have
the
options.
physical side of just, of having options, I think, in so many different areas, even cancer. So, you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned like 23andMe. One of the medical side of the information, the health side, I think is what they call it, on there is looking at a gene called BRCA. And so they look at a couple different mutations, we call them pathogenic variants,
Mm-hmm.
to see, okay, do you have one of the most common three? So it's great. People do this. If they find out they have one, then they can, maybe that's what brings them to a healthcare provider and they never would have before.
Yeah.
I know someone that is a little bit younger than me. So she's like, older side of Gen Z, I guess, like early mid 20s. And she did this test she's adopted, so she wanted to learn more about her ancestry, as we were talking about, and she discovered she had one of these mutations, went to her doctor and actually found like, wow, you have early stage breast cancer, which is
Wow.
very unheard of in your 20s. So
Yeah.
if she didn't do this test, that never would have happened. So
She
I
never
think it's
would have
just so
thought to do it.
important.
Yeah.
She never would have, right? Like I'm
Mm.
27. I've never had a mammogram. I've never had a reason to do that. You usually don't start that until like your mid 30s, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not in the cancer space. I'm kind of trying to remember this, but so it's so important that she had that information to go because it
Mm-hmm.
saved her life. Like she says, like 23andMe saved my life, and and I'm like,
Absolutely.
yeah, it kind of did, right?
Yeah.
But then I think it's also important, kind of still going with this 23andMe example, for people that do the test and it says negative. They don't have a mutation in BRCA. That's not actually true. It's looking at 3 common genes. So, my friend that I'm referring to, she is of Ashkenazi Jewish descent. So it's likely if she's going to have one of the mutations, it's going to be one of those 3 because that's what's common in the Jewish population.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're not Jewish, then it's less likely you're going to have one of those 3. And 23andMe is only looking for those 3. So what about the hundreds of other mutations that you could have? Now you
Yeah.
think you're negative. You're only negative for those 3 changes, not
That's
the
right.
other set
It's just
of
the absence of
hundreds.
those ones, but not the presence of the others.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really important for people to understand all these nuances and like the limitations of testing. What did the test actually do? What did it not do? So
Mm-hmm.
that you understand and you can go to your doctor and say, oh yeah, I did 23andMe, came back negative for the BRCA, but it only looks for those 3 variants. So like, should I do the rest of the testing? That's going to be a much different conversation than telling your doctor, oh, I'm negative for BRCA, because maybe your doctor's just thinking, oh, they had what we call medical grade testing,
Yes.
which is when you do it through like a provider
Pathology.
of some
Yeah.
kind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Versus you order it yourself, you pick it up at Target or whatever, you spit in it and you send it off yourself. No doctor is directly involved in the ordering process.
Mm-hmm.
So that I think is just like knowing and understanding enough to be able to go in to know your resources in the right healthcare provider so that they can then take it from there. I think
Yeah.
that's what's so important in terms of people's own health. And then there's the whole angle of science is cool. People should go into, STEAM fields and everything, because it's just an awesome opportunity. So that's the other part of it, right? Where
Yeah.
I'm kind of like selling the career.
Absolutely. And it is just one of those things where it's making it more accessible so people are thinking about it more, they're a bit more aware of it in a very specific way as opposed to this nebulous, it's just what we do at school and that's it.
Hmm.
Yeah. Cool.
It's way more than that. Yeah. Because even if you don't
Absolutely.
go into these fields, biology is still going to come up for you for the rest of your life in
Yes.
doctor's appointments just to understand basics. And it's helpful to just know certain terminology so that you can, if something comes up, you get a diagnosis, you can start researching that on your own.
Hmm.
And, I always recommend people start those conversations with their provider so they can have some context, because sometimes when you Google things, it's the most extreme cases that come up. So I think that's
Yep.
always good to keep in mind. But once you have that understanding from your provider, then you can say, okay, now I know a little bit more of this. I know some of the terms. Now let me go over to like PubMed, something like that, and say, now I want to dive in deeper. Like, is there other cases? Is there any clinical trials? Start looking at that, something that's available for you or your loved one. So it's just, being educated and knowledgeable, that is power. And
Yep.
being able to then act on that and just understand all of this, or what
Exactly.
you need to in your own space.
Yeah. It's such an important thing to be able to just keep those doors open so that people know that they can empower themselves to keep looking. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah,
Cool.
I agree with that.
Okay. So since I know that you have to get going soon, let's get to the other soft questions. So,
Great.
what hobby or interest do you have that's most unrelated to your field of work?
Most unrelated. That's tough. I feel like it's all related. But I would say probably kayaking. Love
Ooh,
kayaking.
nice.
So that's kind of my spring, summer, fall activity. I recently got a um, kayak that folds up, so it actually just
Oh,
stays under my
wow.
couch. And then
Nice.
it's like origami. You kind of just like fold it and then you throw it in the water and go. So
That's
that's
cool.
kind of been fun. I have a couple other kayaks, but those live at my parents because they would take up a big chunk of my apartment. So
Absolutely. No,
yeah,
that's
but I
cool.
love that being out in the water. I go with my brother a lot that we go kayaking. Sometimes, I go and listen to a podcast or an audiobook or something. But yeah, usually I'm just with my family kayaking in the summer. Just love being on the lake.
Yeah, that is a very cool activity. Nice way to chill.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it really is. Yeah.
cool. And what childhood book holds the strongest memories for you?
I think I already gave my answer away on this
Yeah.
one. Harry Potter, definitely. I mean, I don't know if that's that's a series. But
No, it still
honestly,
counts.
pick any of them. My mom actually read the entire series aloud to my brother and I using
Oh,
different voices and
wow.
everything. So, I mean, Harry Potter basically was my childhood.
Nice.
So I was kind of the perfect age to grow up with the series. And
Yeah.
the trio, the main actors, Dan, Emma, and Rupert, they're about 5 years ish older than me, so
Yeah.
kind of like that perfect role model age gap. So yeah, Harry Potter holds a very special place in my heart, even though I was like a little old when, the sixth and seventh book came out, that I'm like, we still doing this? Is mom reading it out loud to us? I'm like, we got to finish it. This was, we started,
It's
I think
tradition.
yeah, it was tradition. I think we started reading them in like 2001 or something like that. She started reading them aloud to us, maybe 2002. So yeah, we kind of just had to keep it going. But that's definitely, when I think favorite memories from childhood, those are very high on the list. Yeah.
Very, very, very cool. Okay. And lastly, what advice would you give someone who'd like to do what you do? And what advice should they ignore?
Ooh, I like that second part. So advice, I would say definitely go shadow someone and hopefully get an internship. If you can't do one of those things, just ask to meet with someone. As I said, buy them a coffee, even a virtual coffee, or you could just send them like a $5 Starbucks gift card or something. Chat with them on Zoom for a little while and just ask them about their job. Ask them what they don't like about their job too. I think that's really
Yes.
important.
So important.
And if they tell you paperwork, say, okay, what else? Because everybody hates
Everyone
paperwork.
hates paperwork.
So, yeah. So, I think that's part of it. And I think a good way of like finding those opportunities, I tell a lot of students and listeners of mine, like, if you're interested in genetic counseling, genetics, my advice is to go on the National Organizations for Rare Disorders, NORD, N-O-R-D. You just Google that. And it's basically a hub for rare diseases. Most rare diseases are genetic. So if you look at all these different organizations, something that, sparks your interest, contact them and say, hey, I have some time. I'm a high schooler. I'm in college. I would love to give you 5 hours a week to help with your social media. You will learn from them. And, if you're in high school, college, you're Gen Z, you know how social media works. These might be older people that can't figure it out. And so you'll be a perfect match for each other. And what's 5 hours a week? If you can fit that in, they might even be able to pay you. But if not, I think giving them 5 hours a week, especially if it's like on demand, your own time as you're just watching Netflix and you can just like, work on some social media, you'll learn about the condition. You'll start meeting people. Even just writing social media, I think can be
you get to learn
very
from that content.
powerful. Yeah, like you're learning about the disorder, you're learning about the terminology. I think it's such a great way to get your foot in the door. And there's so many, there's 7,000 rare diseases. So I don't think there's necessarily an organization for each one yet at this point, but the list is very much growing. They need help. So I would start there. And who knows where that could lead.
Absolutely.
I had an internship directly with NORD because they're actually in the next to my hometown. So they were like 15 minutes from my parents' house. And I was like, this is perfect. So that totally worked out for me. And then your second part of the question, what advice would I not give? I have to think about that for a second. I would say if you're someone that you wouldn't describe yourself as book smart, do not count yourself out in terms of being, pursuing these types of careers in genetics. I don't consider myself book smart. I'll be honest, I tried really hard in high school. I had pretty good grades in high school, but then once I got to college, it was hard. Chemistry, pre-calculus, though, that definitely brought my GPA down. My GPA by the time I graduated was like 3.2. So it was fine, but it wasn't like, wow, like 3.9, 4.0.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that translates in Australia. I'm realizing. I'm like, is that similar?
It's a different system, but the idea is the same where, if you end up getting just low grades, but you still pass, it's like, it's not the best, but, unless people are looking at your transcript.
Yes. So I think a 3.2, maybe like averages out to be maybe like a B plus or something. So like my genetic classes I did really well in, but these math heavy courses I did not do well in. And so that really brought, my grade point average is what a GPA is. So that brought that down. But I still got into my dream grad school. And I think what was important about that was my experience and exposures to the field were really good. So obviously through the podcast, I also shadowed genetic counselors for a couple summers. I was worked myself up to a communications lead at a genetic counseling company. So all of that, I think, in my personal statement, my recommendations letters, those were my strong suits. My grades were fine, but they weren't my selling point.
Yes.
You do not need to be a brainiac to go into genetics. You do not need to be good at math to go into genetics. Because if those were the cases, I wouldn't be in this career. I wouldn't have made it. So, I think if you are passionate, that can compensate for if you're not super smart,
academic,
everything comes easy to you. I had to study 10 times, I don't know, maybe I'm being extreme, but I had to study much harder than my peers to get even similar grades to them. Really realized that when I was living with roommates that did not study as much as me and they got the same grades. So, I think it's really more about, are you passionate about this? Are you really excited about it? And are you ready to constantly learn and push yourself to know, like, once you know resources, you can do it, right? You don't need to like know how to do basic math. You have a calculator, right? So it's like, it's more about learning your resources and how to find them. So I would hate to hear people don't pursue this because they've been told in the past, your grades aren't that good. Don't try.
Yeah.
Do it. Try.
Absolutely. Just give it a go. And there's always other avenues to get to where you need to be.
Yeah. And sometimes it takes a couple rounds to get in. So, some of the best genetic counselors I know, they did not get in on their first round. When I was applying, So this was like 4 years ago. I was applying in 2017 for grad school, and the acceptance rate was about 31%.
Mm-hmm.
So of all the people that applied, 31% actually matched with a program. And it's more competitive now. It's probably more like 28% now or something. I'm kind of guessing, but
Yeah.
it's competitive. But don't be discouraged.
Mm-hmm.
Go for another year.
Yeah.
A lot of people match on their second year.
That's awesome. It's good to know.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So yeah, wrapping up now, since you got to go. So thank you so much, Kira, for speaking with me today on CPART. It has been amazing learning about your journey and how passionate you are about genetics and genetic counselling.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Yeah, it's just absolutely amazing, and I totally could keep talking. Yeah, if people want to know more about what you do, and yeah, where can they go?
Yes, you guys can head over to dnatoday.com. You can also, wherever you're listening to this, I'm sure we're also listed. So you can search DNA Today. We're the green logo. And we've got over, depending on when this episode comes out, we've got nearly 200 episodes.
Amazing.
10 years. If there's a topic that we haven't covered that you want to hear about, let me know. There's a contact form on the website there. And would love if you guys listen to rate and review the show. Also, if you haven't rate and reviewed Steam podcast here, what are you doing? Please do that.
Amazing. Thank you.
So yeah. So that is the best way to support podcasts in a free, easy way. It helps us all climb up in the charts and just have more people discover the show. So yeah, dnatoday.com is your hub.
Thank you. And yeah, definitely appreciate this freak. Need it. Okay.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Kira. It's been amazing speaking with you today, and I hope you have an amazing day.
Yeah, you too. It was a great way to start my day and hopefully end yours over there.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Thank you. I've loved speaking with Kira about genetic counselling and some of the nuances of genetics, because in context, it's the kind of knowledge that can empower us and give us options when it comes to better understanding our personal health. To learn more about Kira and what we discuss in the show, or to connect with us, please visit the STEAMpowered website at steampoweredshow.com. You can also find out more about Kira and DNA Today at dnapodcast.com, the link for which will be in the show notes. If you enjoy this conversation, please let me know. Subscribe to the show, leave us a rating, and share this with your geeky or geek-curious friends. You can also support STEAMpowered on Patreon and Ko-fi and the STEAMpowered Show, the links for which will also be in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.